Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to our third part of our series in creating a deepfake. So in this particular episode, we're going to be talking about what you need to do to finish up the training process that we began in part 2 and how do you get the absolute best quality you can at the end of that. So when you're training, it's going to continue to improve in quality, but the quality is only going to improve so much. There are some extra settings you can do at the end to get some more of that, and we're going to start off with that. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Train SAE HD, which is what we were doing last time. In this case, I'm going to continue this, and I'm going to select the model that I was training before, choose a graphics card. In the next couple seconds, I'm going to go ahead and press the button so I can override and feed it different settings. There's a couple of things we're going to change. And just to emphasize, this is an optional step, but it does improve the quality quite a bit. So I'm going to keep the auto backup and everything the same, write preview history, choose image. I already did that in previous steps, so I'll just leave that as is. Target duration, whatever you had it set to is fine, unless you hit that target duration. I enable random warp samples. In the previous video, in part 2, I did have this on. And what that does is it's going to adjust the facial expressions a little bit. And it does do a good job, but if you're wanting to run some extra things, you're going to want to turn this off. So in this case, I do have this turned off. And when we're getting to the next step, which is right here, GAN. Now, this is a setting that I use almost always. I can't think of any cases I don't use this anymore. And what this does is it's going to try and make the faces and the shape sharper. Up until this point, usually the deepfakes are looking a little bit blurry. You add this for maybe 40,000 samples or something like that, it really sharpens things up. If you put too high of a value, it will start to make the image a little bit aliased or a little bit blotchy. So you probably don't want to go above a value of 0.1 or 0.15. I found that what I'm going to more often than not is just 0.1. And everything else I'm going to kind of leave on at this point. I'm not going to do any color transfer. We're going to get to that next step. Enable gradient clipping is, remember, going to help your deepfake to stop it from failing. So I'm always going to leave that on. And then pre-training, we're not doing that. So go ahead and press enter. Now, at the end of that, I'll go ahead and let it start training again. And again, if you're turning on GAN for the first time, you'll probably want to give it at least about 40,000 samples. And so what you could do is, if you know where your deepfake left off, so if I go ahead and go under, let's see, if I go under the workspace folder and I go under my model folder and I go under let's see, this pre-train, so summary, whatever you named your deepfake, it's going to be underscore summary. If I double click this guy, I'm going to go to be able to see it left off at 426,284 samples. So if I wanted to train that 40,000 more samples at that very early on step up at the top here, where I told it how many iterations I wanted, I could just add 40,000 to whatever that was in the summary file, and then I know it would stop after that amount. All right, so what do we do once your training is all done? You're happy with how the quality has come out. How do we start actually getting this all put together? So I'm going to go back to the main deepfake folder, and down here underneath train, again, we're just going down the line, I'm going to do merge SAE HD, and it's going to ask me which model do I want to use. In this case, I only have one, so I'll go and select that. And in this case, sometimes it does use multiple graphics cards if you happen to have them, because it's going to use one graphics card per frame and it will go a little bit faster. So I'll go ahead and use all these right now. If you only have one graphics card, it's still going to work perfectly fine. I do find this step, I think, is a little bit more limited as far as CPU. So I think usually my CPU is a little bit blasted in this, but we'll take a look at it a little bit. So I do want to use the interactive merger so I can see the results as I'm adjusting things interactively. And it's going to go ahead and load the alignments and the images on the graphics cards, and then it will give us a more user-friendly interface. And here we go. So we're going to get this window right here. It gives us, thankfully, a lot of the keyboard shortcuts. I always have to revisit them. I don't use a lot of these because the final compositing work I'm doing inside another program like After Effects or Nuke or things like that. The main ones are the color transfer mode and then the mask mode itself. I used to use things like super resolution, but I found like that was giving me more aliased results and a little bit splotchy. So the main things are these guys right here. We're going to change the overlay modes a little bit, maybe just to explain it, but not that much. And the main other keys we're going to use is just go from frame to frame and have those settings carried over. You can always go from this keyboard shortcut menu to the actual imagery just by pressing tab. And so that's going to just go back and forth between these two guys right here. So here's the first frame of our deepfake, and you can see already we're getting a pretty good result here. We want to try and make it a little bit cleaner. So if I press tab to go back, you can see the mask mode is X on the keyboard. So I'm going to go ahead and do X. And as I do that, let me have this on screen here so we can see this. It's going to change some of the settings I have right here. So we can see mask mode is what it has right now. And I think that's actually a pretty good mode. The main thing is we're not going to look at the absolute splitting of the forehead and things like that, because we're going to do that in the compositing package. It's more, how does this look on the screen as a whole? So we might go back. So this is learned DST. So I'll go ahead and press X for mask mode. And we'll let it see if we get particular results. When we're seeing the hourglass up here, it's computing and trying to adjust your look of the mask. So clearly that one's not working too great for me. And again, we're mostly looking at the color. So this is not an extreme lighting example. So if I wanted to try and go to a different frame, I can always use the period and comma. You can go through the frames. And if you had a particular shot you knew was going to be difficult, you might try and find that particular frame. And you can see the reason it's not trying to replace Elizabeth Shue's face is because we didn't include that in the alignment stage when we were actually choosing what images we wanted to try and train and place. We just chose it. We deleted those frames because it wasn't the deep actor's face. This might be a good one because it's closer up, but I'm going to try and go to another frame where we have some more interactive lighting. And I might pause the recording because I have to, unfortunately, we can't jump around interactively and scroll through. We have to go through the frames in order. Now, it's not uncommon to have sections where the face does go in and out. So you can see here where he's on the aquarium, the face is kind of, the replacement face kind of pops on and off. And the reason for that is it wasn't able to detect the face well enough on these particular frames, but it did on these. So what you could do in that earlier step that I talked about in the part 2 video is you can do the detect faces plus manual fix. And that would let you try and manually place the faces on these frames where it wasn't able to detect it. Now, some funny things do come out of these deepfakes sometimes. So in this particular case, the original actor was actually winking with one eye, but the deepfake didn't recognize that it actually needed to do the eyes separately. And so instead of doing a wink, he just does a blink. So you get some funny stuff. In certain cases, you maybe could fix that if you needed to. It's not a perfect science, but you can definitely do some fun stuff. So depending on the transfer mode you use, sometimes you will get nice interactive lighting and sometimes you won't. So there's a shot here where you see his face is kind of following the original actor, and we're getting some interactive light in the actual shot itself. And you see, there we go. So you see police lights. Cool thing is, you can see this is actually sampling the color a little bit and putting it onto the replacement face, even though the original footage doesn't have that. So this is a really, really cool benefit, because doing interactive light, if you're trying to do it after the fact, is very difficult and it might not come out correctly. So what we would probably try and do here is, at least since this is a more complex frame, is choose a color transfer mode that is going to give us interactive lighting. We still haven't really knocked down the mask mode, so I'm going to go ahead and go through this a little bit more with X and just see which one I feel like is giving us the best starting point. Not looking too bad. So anyway, you kind of go through and find out which one is probably going to look the best for you. So if you want to, you can do the blur mask in the program itself. So the mask is this little section we're splitting it together right here. So I can do E and D to up and down that. So you can see if I go ahead and use E, you can see this number is getting bigger, and that means it's going to blur this edge more. The great part is you might be able to get pretty decent results inside the program without having to do any work after the fact. So that looks pretty darn good. And as far as the mask goes, but we don't have a great result for the color. At least I think we can get a little bit better. So again, the keyboard shortcut to change the color transfer mode is C. So right next to each other on the keyboard, we'll go and go through and see if we find a better transfer mode. That looks a little bit too dark over here. Doesn't look too bad. Again, kind of dark. That looks like it has funky color. Now, the only tricky part about this is that this color transfer mode might not work well for this particular shot, but it might work great for another shot. So you can have it only work on certain frames, but that tends to be quite a pain. So you can find something that maybe is not as extreme, but works overall for all your shots. It's probably gonna be a little bit easier. MKL is one that I tend to use quite a bit, or one of the variants. So MKL-M in this case doesn't work that well. So some of these take much longer to process than others. You can see how long that one took, just that one frame. So it looks like RCT or MKL are ones that I'm liking. I think RCT is working fine overall for this. It's not perfect, but it's not bad at all. Now I need to check it on the other frames. So if I want to, I'm going to press tab to go back to my controls. If I want to apply this all the way to the end and all the way to the beginning, you can see there's different options here. So again, I was using period and comma to go to previous and next frame. If I want to override the shift and the question mark to go forward in time, I do shift and M to go back in time. So I'm going to go ahead and do shift, and there we go. So you can see that applied all the way to the end, or it's going to go all the way to the end. I'll do shift in the other direction. All right, so I have a pretty good idea of what I'm getting here. I'm going to go ahead and have that render out all the way to the end. I'll go ahead and just double check and make sure it's overriding the config. So shift and then the question mark key. So it goes all the way to the end of the sequence. And so now since I know I'm on the first frame, I'm going to go ahead and hold down shift and then do either period or comma to go forward or back. I'm going to have it render all the way to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and do shift and then period, and that's going to start rendering all the frames. You can see the process that it's going through here. And the nice part is the frames, like with Elizabeth Shue and other people in the shots or the lobster, things like that, it doesn't detect any faces on those frames, so it's going to render those much more quickly. And just to give you an idea on what's actually being used here, here are my graphics cards and my CPU. This is mostly CPU based because you can see this is maxing out basically at 100%. The graphics card itself, if I switch it to CUDA, the graphics cards are getting used, but this is mostly a CPU-bound operation. So that multiple graphics cards will speed things up, but it's not going to be a huge, huge difference. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and let that process, and then we'll pick up in the next step. All right, so once it's done processing the frames, you're going to go and select your window and press escape to exit, and that will exit out there. Pressing continue, that'll close out that batch window. And now you can go ahead and go into your workspace destination folder, and you should have these now merged and merged mask folders in your project. And you by no means have to use particular compositing applications, but just so I can take a look at what I have, I'm going to drop in the merge folder in here in Nuke, and I'm also going to drag in the merge mask and just go ahead and bring this on screen so we can take a look here. And I'll try and size this so everything fits. So I'm going to load this up and take a look at what we have. And like we kind of saw in the previous step, we have the Jason Momoa face on the deep actor. And we can see that the frames are coming out basically the exact same as we had in the program. And then also from that merged mask folder, if I press 1 here, it's basically giving us a cutout for all those frames. So the great part is, if you have, and let me go ahead and get all 3 here. Let me bring in the original footage here. Now, when we have the original footage from the show, in this case, The Boys, and we have our merged version with Jason Momoa, and then we also have this mask, it gives you almost infinite flexibility in being able to pick and choose how you're going to blend these two together and how strong these edges are. But then most importantly is after the fact, you can color correct and tweak just these areas. Whereas if you try to do it all in the deepfake software, you don't really have much control after the fact anymore. So if I go to, say, these shots here, I might have a lot more work on my hands trying to get these ones to work in the car with the interactive lighting and everything. You can see like this is not working here, versus ones where he's just talking right here might not be as much work to get looking correctly. These look a little bit closer, aside from, again, the lines that we can adjust interactively. So let me go ahead and get my setup going. We'll try and cover the basics in different compositing applications. So whichever one you have, you'll have an idea on how to go about it, or at least you kind of understand the fundamentals on how you can go about and see the flexibility you have in doing things after the fact. All right, so let's go ahead and do a composite for at least one shot in the deepfake. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the footage. I'm going to go ahead and do File, Import Multiple Files. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the 3 image sequences, the first one being the original footage of the deep. I'm going to go ahead and bring in our merged image sequence. And of course, since these are numerically rendered, it's going to go ahead and detect the sequence and bring them in as such. And then last but not least, I need to go and bring in our mask image sequence. So merged mask, select that, open. And now I have 3 different image sequences. They're all named the same. I'm going to go and just make a new composition out of the first one. And you can see this is the original footage. I'm going to go and drag in the other 2 image sequences into the comp as well. And the first thing I want to do, since they're all named the same, I want to be able to keep track of them. Let's select this first one, press enter. I'll just go ahead and call this original. So this is the original footage from The Boys. I'll go ahead and turn that off and turn on the eye icon for the second one. This is our deepfake, so let's call this DF. And the last one, by process of elimination, of course, is going to do the mask, so I'll call this mask. Again, just press enter and type the name, press enter again. So now I know what these are. And if you're familiar at all with After Effects, we want to cut out our deepfake. Basically, we want to cut out our deepfake face by the mask that we have right here. So I'm going to put this at the top of the stack for a second. I'm going to drag the mask on top of that. So I have my cutout on top of my deepfake footage here. And what I'm going to do is if you don't see this track matte one, you're going to click on this toggle switches modes, and that might have that show up. And under track matte, for the deepfake, I'm going to have it choose the matte from, or the cutout from above it, which is our mask channel. So where it says track matte, let's say cutout based on the brightness, meaning what's white and what's black or shades of gray, and go ahead and cut out this layer, the deepfake layer, with that luminosity of the lumimatte. When I do that, you can see it hasn't actually gotten rid of that information. If I turn off no track matte, it's all still there, but it's going to cut it out with this black and white cutout that I have above it. So I'm going to go and choose lumimatte, and then we're doing well there. If I go ahead and just select this first shot, I'll go ahead and turn this off real quick just so I can frame up these. I'm going to do page up and page down to go through the frames. I'll go ahead and just say this is my end point, so I'll press N for end, and that's going to adjust this playback region just to that right here. So we have this one shot where we say in ocean land. We'll go ahead and lumimatte. Now we have just this floating head that says the words again. And if I go and turn on my original footage right here, you can see that we have basically the exact same result from the merge layers. We just have the floating head on top of the original footage. But now we have the flexibility of adjusting this face however we want and not being locked into what we had in the deepfake software. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here so I can see what I'm doing a little bit more. Just using the mouse wheel, and then I'll use the middle mouse button to frame this up. And thankfully, this is not going to be too complex. We're going to try and blur the edge a little bit and maybe bring things in a little bit. And then we might sharpen the footage a little bit since I think it's a little bit softer. So to start off with, to blur these edges a little bit, we need to affect, I'm going to turn this on just so we can see it by itself. We need to affect this mask channel. So if we wanted to blur this, we'll go ahead and in effects and presets, we'll go ahead and type blur. Actually, we'll go ahead and type Gaussian blur. So there we go, Gaussian blur. If you wanted to go through the menu, of course, you can go up to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and then Gaussian blur. We'll add that. If I go ahead and start to use the blurriness slider here, you can see it's going to blur this out. And remember, since this is controlling the cutout of this, if I go ahead and view this guy right here, I'll turn off the top layer. You can see it's actually blurring the edges and making them a little bit softer. But the downside is it's actually bringing in more of the shot than we want. So if we go ahead and view this on the final result right now, it doesn't look too bad, but it's not able to really give us a clean edge here. You can see that this edge right here along the forehead isn't getting much better than it was before because it's not getting past that edge. What we want to do is we want to shrink in this edge on all sides a little bit and then blur it out. So it's going to blur out before it hits this hard boundary we have right here. So to illustrate that a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and go up to Effect, Matte, Simple Choker. And what this does is it's going to shrink the matte in or out, but it's assuming that the matte is going to be on the alpha channel. Now remember, on all these, I'll just use the original footage as an example. I can go to red, green, blue, alpha. We can see this particular image has a solid white alpha. If I go to our mask, I'll only view that. We have red, green, blue. So far so good. We have our cutout on all those, and then alpha. Oh, the alpha is completely white, so that's actually not what we want. Since this choker only affects the alpha channel, we need to say, hey, this color information, or this black and white, we need that to be in the alpha channel as well. So on this mask input, we're going to go ahead and use an effect called shift channels. I'm going to put this at the top of the stack, and you can reassign one color channel to another color channel. So it's saying by now, take the alpha channel from the alpha, keep the red as the red, the green, the blue as the blue. All these are fine except for the alpha channel. So I'm going to make sure I'm viewing the alpha channel, which right now in this particular image is completely white. I'm going to say, you know what, take the alpha channel from one of these color channels. And when I do that, you can see now this alpha channel is the same as the red, the green, and the blue. So now we can go back and know that if we're going to affect the alpha channel, it's going to be using that black and white cutout since we use the shift channels to get there. All right, so now that I have all the effects on here, the order does matter. So I have the alpha being taken from the red, which is what we want, and we have the blur and the choker. I want to shrink in this edge first and then blur it out. So I'm going to put the choker above the Gaussian blur in my stack of effects. So now if I adjust my choker, you can see it shrinking it down a little bit. And you can do it, more or less depending on what you need. And then if I go ahead and use this blur, it's going to blur that edge. But again, we're not running into the original edge. We're shrinking in a little bit so we have some leeway in how we're doing it. So now we have a pretty decent result with minimal effort. And based on the shot, whether it's an extreme close-up or a further shot, we can adjust this more dynamically and get better results. And in fact, I can still see the top right here a little bit more, so maybe I'll go ahead and use the choker just slightly more. And there we go. Now I don't really see that edge anymore, and I can always adjust the blur to fix it just a little bit more if I want as well. So there we go. So I think that gives me a pretty good result with minimal effort, and now everything's feeding into the edges a lot better. The last little thing I might do is its face is a little bit soft compared to the original footage. So on the actual deepfake itself, on the color footage, I'm going to go ahead and add a slight sharpen. And you might need to blur it and soften it out in other cases. But I'll go ahead and just add a slight little sharpen just to maybe add a little bit more depth. If I do this too much, you can see, definitely don't want that. But add just a little bit of sharpening. I see a little bit of graininess, but overall I think that looks a little bit better. Maybe I'll split the difference. Let's go and do a value of 9 instead of 18. All right, so there we go. So this is a very quick example. We didn't do any color correction because this particular frame looks pretty good. If you needed to color correct the footage, say it was too green or too blue or whatever, you can go ahead and do that however you're used to doing color correction. To effect, color correction ones I tend to like are curves or levels, or you can always do saturation might be a good one. If it's just too green or too blue, you can always adjust the master saturation and the hue in whatever direction you need to. But overall, this shot's looking pretty good. I might add just a little bit of color tweaking, but overall I think this is good. Now we'll jump into Nuke. I won't take too much time in there because I think the majority of people aren't going to be using Nuke, but might be using something like After Effects. But we'll take another shot at it in there. All right, so without getting into too much detail, but giving you a general idea, inside of Nuke, which is what the compositor I use to do my comps here, is I have 3 different inputs. One for the deepfake version, which if you go ahead and take a look at these, is what we had before. So here's RJSMO deepfake. So I'll go ahead and plug this into here. This input is for a mask. I'll go and plug this guy in. And then we have our original footage that we can go ahead and plug in here. And we have a number of things that are happening here. But basically what this is doing is it's going to take the cutout and make that available to the software so we can use that to try and blend things in. And it's going to go ahead and take the original footage and put it on top of that. So at the very base, if I'm not doing anything else, it's going to put that on top of there. And the flexibility we have is now we can, after the fact and on a shot-by-shot basis, adjust the softening and the blurriness of this edge here. So if I go ahead and take a look at this filter road, I have it set to affect only the alpha channel. And then I have this blur that I'm going to press D to enable. And you can see the blur by itself, without having done the erode at all, is already making things look a lot cleaner. But there's only so far that this blur can blur out, but it's still hitting this edge. So the filter erode, basically what it does, if I feed it a positive value, it's going to go one direction, and a negative value, it's going to go another. So if I go ahead and eat this in a little bit, and then adjust my blur accordingly, I'll go and start this at 0. I can go ahead and get a decent mix to where I'm not really seeing the edge anymore. And it is there a little bit. So it's definitely still present, but for the rest of the face, it's not looking too bad. And again, I can go ahead and turn on and off my filter erode. It is kind of feeding in a little bit more, but it is giving me more issues over here by having that. And then I also have blur that is kind of softening the edges. So in this particular shot, what I would probably try and do is I like the look of not having the filter erode affecting the sides of the face here. This looks a little bit cleaner, I think, as far as bleeding in. The color needs some work, and maybe we'll start with that. So we'll set the filter erode and the blur just to some kind of default values and see how they look overall. This is not looking too bad. And then we'll try and get as much out of the color as we can. So I have an overall contrast and overall color. I would say that probably, this is not too contrasty the original shot right here. There's not too much contrast going on, but I think this is probably a little bit less contrast. So if I select this, and again, the contrast is the difference between the brightest point and the lowest point of the face. It's going to make it brighter and more contrasty. And then the gamma down is going to make you darker and more contrasty. So these guys can kind of work in opposition to each other to give you the look you're kind of after. And if I adjust this, again, just very, very slightly, and I go and press D to disable this, It's a slight difference, but maybe a little bit more in the realm, and I can always obviously disable these adjustments if I need to. And so I'm going to double click on overall color here, and just in the multiplier of the gamma node, I'm going to hold down Control and left click on the color wheel here. I'll bring this over here so you can see what I'm doing. And I feel like this is a little bit more greenish, whereas this is a little bit more, I guess, a little bit warmer. So I'll maybe take this in this direction just a little bit. And I think that's maybe already making a pretty decent difference. Again, you can see I'm making it just a little bit more greenish. And if I disable this overall color right here, yeah, maybe I added even a little bit too much. So I'll maybe back off on that just a bit. Let me go and take a look. How's it look? Yeah, it's a little bit better as far as feeding into the forehead and things like that. And if I select both of these guys, drag a box around, press D, I can see here's where I started, here's where I went to. Not a huge difference, but it does feed in a little bit better. Now again, I don't really like the sides of the face here, how you can see the original whiskers, and obviously our deepfake version isn't going to be able to be as crisp and sharp as that. So a couple things we could do, we could try and sharpen the footage, which I usually don't do, but if we wanted to try that, we certainly could. So let's say below this guy, I'll select my grade and I'll press tab. I'm going to start to type sharpen. I'll add that. We could try and sharpen the footage, but you can see kind of what happens. You start to get this funky, it gets a little bit too, you start to see the splotchiness on it. So you could certainly try a sharpen, but I don't think that's probably going to be a great solution overall. But if we just add a little bit, it's not too bad, I guess. But it's mostly just the forehead that's not working here. And there's a number of ways you could do this. If you want to use the planar tracker, you certainly can. That's going to try and track that shape over time. I'll go and do that just a little bit to give you an idea. So right now it looks like this particular shot is from about 847. So I'm going to go ahead and make a sticky note, press tab and type sticky note, just so I can remind myself. So 847 to, let's go ahead and use the arrow keys and get to where the shot ends. Oh, is this a winking shot? I guess this is a winking shot. All right, so we'll go ahead and wait until it changes. And 847 to 949. So this is just for my own reference right here. But if I wanted to go ahead and track just this area, I'll go ahead and in the planar tracker, we'll track a range. So we'll start at 847. And I'll go ahead and draw the shape on here. So I'll go ahead and do B-spline or natural spline. And just so I can see where exactly the forehead line is, I'm going to disable these cutouts here so I can see very clearly where that's at. With this guy selected, I'll go and say I want to try and track this section and texture here. I'm going to go and give it, and it's going to be tracking the original footage, not the JSON Momoa footage. And I'll say the original footage I want to track, I'm going to track a range. So this is track forward a range. I'm going to start at 847 like we talked about. We're going to end at 949 and let it go ahead and do its thing. And you can see it's following this texture of the forehead, which is really, really nice. It's way better than having to do it by hand. And it will mess up in certain spots because this is not a flat surface, but it's going to do a decent enough job. So it looks like it's doing a great job up till here, and then it kind of starts moving. So I'll go ahead and just nudge this a little bit on these particular frames. And then when it really gets out of alignment, I'll go ahead and try and relocate it so where it follows a little bit better. If I need to rotate this and things like that, I certainly can do that. And it looks like it sticks the rest of the way, not too bad. All right, so we'll say that's a decent enough solution there. I need to make sure to plug this guy in as well. You can see it's cutting off a little bit too much, or at least a little bit too harsh. So if I use this blur right here, I can try and feed this back into the original footage. And I still have a little bit I need to fix over here, but now I can't really see the transition of the forehead nearly as much. But I still have this nice sharp area over here. So basically what it's done is it's made the forehead independent from the rest of the face. And so I'm going to have more freedom in how I'm going to split this stuff in. So I can go ahead and still apply the filter or road if I wanted to feed this in a little bit more. And I can try and use the blur to make it a little bit sharper, but this is not really going to affect the forehead anymore. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I imagine probably the majority of you aren't going to be doing your comping in a program like Nuke. Great one. And then another great one that if you like node-based like Nuke is, with having kind of the flow chart, and you have DaVinci Resolve, Blackmagic Fusion is built in. It's its own tab. You can do very similar things inside of Fusion. If you'd like me to cover a tutorial on how to do that in there, I certainly can. But definitely the thing I kind of want to try and really emphasize is the composite and how you put it together is going to make probably the best quality result. Whereas if you try to do everything inside of Deepfake software, you can get some great results, but you're limited by either having to chop up everything one by one and your mask mode and your color mode and your mask blur, all that shot by shot, or you have to apply it uniformly to everything, which makes it a little bit difficult to work with. All right, so I know it's been quite a journey getting to this point, but in this 3-part series, we've covered everything from hardware considerations to gathering your footage, prepping the images, running the training, and then all the way through to compositing. With that, we've completed our series. Thank you very much for watching. Please post in the comments if you're doing any deepfakes yourselves. I'd love to see them. I'll see you on the next Johnny How To.